Hannah Miller pushed the rattling cart along the glossy corridor of the West Ridge Grand Hotel. Her sneakers thin and worn from too many double shifts, the wheels squeaking every few steps as the polished mahogany walls reflected the faint glow of chandeliers from beyond closed doors. From inside the grand ballroom drifted the soft strains of music, the laughter of the city's elite, and the clinking of champagne glasses raised in toasts that cost more than her entire week's wage. The chandeliers dripped with crystals like captured stars, and Hannah in her plain uniform kept her eyes lowered, focusing on linens and glassware, willing herself to be invisible. She thought she was invisible until the billionaire's eyes found her. That line would shape everything that followed, but for now she only knew the ache of exhaustion. Her back burned, her arms stung from bleach, and her heart sagged beneath burdens heavier than the cart itself. Just a year earlier, she had been a teacher standing before eager children. Her classroom a world of apples on desks and wide eyes filled with promise. Then her father was arrested for financial fraud, his name printed in headlines that tainted hers. Parents whispered, colleagues avoided her, and the shame drove her to resign. Bills mounted regardless, rent climbed. Her mother's prescriptions grew more expensive with every refill. To survive, she took the work she could find, scrubbing rooms and banquet halls that housed lives she would never touch. That night, the air of the hotel mixed citrus polish with perfume so costly it made her chest tighten. Through a sliver of open door, she glimpsed gowns shimmering like molten silver and tuxedos fitted to perfection, a stage where she could never stand. She was the unseen hand keeping it gleaming. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a cruel reminder. The landlord's message glared across the cracked screen, final notice before eviction proceedings. She pressed it away, her throat closing, then thought of her mother at home, coughing between doses of medication they could not afford. Each shift, each paycheck was not just for rent, but for life itself. Inside the ballroom, the gala swelled to its peak. Wealthy guests clapping to the quartet, waiters gliding with white gloves like dancers across polished marble. Hannah stood at the edge, clearing forgotten glasses, shrinking into the shadows. No one looked twice at her, but she still felt judged, her uniform shouting failure louder than her silence could contain. She told herself to endure a few more hours, another paycheck, another chance to buy pills that might grant her mother rest. As she bent to pick up a glass light from the chandelier, caught her face. Across the room, Richard Blackwell noticed. Richard was not simply another guest. At 35, he was a billionaire, an heir and architect of one of the largest investment groups in the country. A man whose sharp eyes and precise decisions had made him a fixture on magazine covers. He carried with him the solemn shadow of tragedy. His wife lost 3 years ago in a sudden accident, leaving him alone at the summit of power. The press hounded him constantly about alliances and remarriage, about which woman might one day share his fortune and name. Tonight he had come alone once again, shrugging off questions with practiced charm. Then he saw her. She was not adorned in jewels, nor posed like the women who circled his world. She was bent over a tray, strands of brown hair slipping from a net. Her face drawn with fatigue, yet lit with something resilient. His gaze held steady, an instinct he could not explain. Hannah felt it, like a spark against her skin, the uneasy knowledge of being watched. Straightening quickly, She met his eyes for one suspended heartbeat, then dropped her gaze, her cheeks burning. Men like him never noticed women like her, yet he had. The narration of her life until that second was one of decline of dignity, stripped away by scandal of nights trading lesson plans for bleach. And yet every story has a pivot, a moment when the unseen becomes unavoidable. Hannah, gathering glasses and swallowing shame, was about to step into hers. She moved to another table, ignoring the pounding of her heart, listening to conversations about market indexes and vacation homes as if such things were universal concerns. She wanted to tell them about rationing medication and counting change at pharmacies, about eviction notices and hospital bills. But silence was the only shield she had. Richard barely heard the chatter around him. His eyes followed her movements, the economy of her gestures, the way she tried to erase herself. He recognized something that mirrored his own loneliness, that endurance of carrying burdens in silence. In that crowded ballroom, beneath crystal lights and marble splendor, a woman who thought she was invisible had caught the attention of a man who thought nothing could surprise him again. The setup was complete. Hannah Miller, once a teacher, now a cleaner pressed by debt and humiliation, thought she was a shadow. She could not yet know that shadows sometimes draw the gaze more than the brightest flame, and that in the minutes to come her life would twist into a path she never dared imagine. The ballroom pulsed with a rhythm of wealth and expectation, each note of the quartet and each toast layered with unspoken negotiations. Richard Blackwell stood near the head table, framed by political donors and industry magnates, but his attention was elsewhere. For months he had endured the relentless pressure of whispers, questions about his solitude and the calculated advances of women chosen by powerful families who saw his hand not as a matter of love but of legacy. He was 35, still young by the standards of empire, but burdened with the memory of his wife's sudden death, a scar that had closed him off from intimacy. Tonight, however, the pressure sharpened. A senator's wife leaned closer, her jewels glittering, her smile sharp. "Richard," she purred, "surely it is time you considered who will stand beside you. The gala is not only for charity, it is for future." Around her, heads nodded, the murmurs rising into a subtle chorus. He felt the weight of eyes of families who wanted his allegiance bound through marriage. The pressure was suffocating. He sipped his drink, his jaw tight. Then his gaze, restless and searching for escape, landed again on Hannah Miller. She was in the far corner, clearing away half-empty flutes with her shoulders drawn tight. Her uniform marking her as a servant, yet the way she moved was steady, unyielding. She was out of place among sequins and silk, yet somehow more real than all of them. Something within him snapped into focus. He felt a rush of reckless clarity, a defiance rising against the cages of expectation. His voice cut across the hum of the room. "Bring me that girl." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, silence swallowed the music and chatter. Guests turned, confusion flickering, then disbelief, as eyes followed the line of his hand. He was not pointing toward the polished daughters of wealth who vied for his attention, but toward the woman in a cleaner's uniform, frozen mid-step. Hannah felt her world tilt. The tray in her hands rattled glasses, trembling as though echoing her fear. Heat rushed to her face as every head in the ballroom pivoted to see her. Her stomach dropped. She thought at first he meant to humiliate her, to make her the butt of some cruel display. The distance between her corner and his table stretched like a gauntlet, each step a sentence. Her legs trembled as she set the tray, down her hands clammy. A manager whispered harshly, "Go, go now," and she had no choice. She stepped forward to each stride under 100 piercing eyes. Murmurs rose. "Is he serious?" one man hissed. "That girl is staff." A woman sneered. Hannah felt the sting of their gaze burn against her skin. Her heart hammered so loudly, she feared they could hear it over the silence. Richard stood calm, his hand, lowered his face unreadable. He did not waver, did not glance away as Hannah approached. She wanted to disappear, to flee, but her body carried her forward until she stood before him, her breath shallow. For a long moment no one spoke. Richard looked at her directly, his dark eyes steady, and in them she read not mockery, but something else, something she could not define. Hannah, though trembling, raised her chin, fractionally clinging to the last threads of dignity. A faint flash of cameras from the back of the room caught her peripheral vision. Unbeknownst to her, a freelance journalist had already lifted a phone, capturing the bizarre scene the billionaire pointing the cleaner summoned. The photo would be sent out within minutes, a spark waiting for oxygen. Richard extended a hand toward her, as though she belonged, as though the stares of the elite did not matter. His calmness unsettled her even more than the laughter she had feared. She did not know whether to take his hand, whether this was kindness or another kind of trap. The senator's wife looked scandalized. Her lips parted as whispers surged through the crowd like wildfire. Richard's voice, even and resonant, broke the tension. "She will join me." The certainty in his tone left no room for challenge. Around them, discomfort bristled. Hannah's pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to cry, to protest, to demand why, but her lips remained sealed. She was no longer invisible, and the spotlight burned cruelly. The murmurs thickened. Is this a game? Is he making a statement? Has he lost his mind? Margaret, a socialite, who had tried more than once to insert herself into Richard's orbit, leaned toward her neighbor with venom from the cleaning staff, really. But Richard ignored them all. He gestured for a chair to be brought beside him, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to seat Hannah at his table. The quartet resumed faltering before finding rhythm again. The gala's facade creaked but did not collapse. Hannah sat stiffly, her hands trembling in her lap, unsure where to look. Aware that the room's attention had not drifted, she was an outsider pulled into the center of their stage, and though she did not yet understand why, she sensed that her life had shifted irreversibly. In the far corner, the journalist checked his phone, the captured photo already uploading, with a caption forming in his mind. By morning, strangers across the city would be asking the same question that filled the ballroom now. Who is she? For Richard, the choice had been instinct, a strike against suffocating tradition. But for Hannah, it was the beginning of something she could neither predict nor control. The moment the gala ended, Hannah hoped to vanish into anonymity again, to slip back into the safety of the service corridor and pretend the incident had been some strange dream. But Richard Blackwell did not release her back into obscurity. As applause scattered and guests rose to mingle, he stood and with a subtle gesture to his head of security, directed that Hannah be escorted with him toward the velvet rope section. Her steps faltered, every instinct urging her to run, yet the sight of his composed figure ahead drew her forward like gravity. The crowd parted reluctantly, eyes lingering on the cleaner who had been summoned like some pawn into a game she did not understand. They entered a private wing, the hum of conversation muffling behind gilded doors, until only the low hum of hidden lights remained. Hannah's pulse echoed in her ears as she was led into a suite that seemed built for royalty walls, lined with dark wood leather sofas and a view of the city spread glittering beyond floor-to-ceiling glass. Richard turned, his presence filling the space with quiet command. "Sit," he said softly, and though his voice held no threat, Hannah obeyed, perching on the edge of a chair. He poured water into a crystal glass, set it gently before her, then lowered himself opposite her with a measured calm that contrasted sharply with her trembling nerves. "I owe you an explanation," he began. "Tonight was not about humiliating you. It was about escaping them." Hannah clutched the glass, but did not drink, her voice caught between fear and disbelief. "Escaping who?" Richard's lips curved in something between amusement and weariness. "Everyone out there," he said, tilting his head toward the ballroom. "They want me married again, aligned with their families, bound by contracts written in diamonds and influence. They do not see me as a man, Hannah. They see me as an empire." Hannah stared, her chest tight, uncertain why he was telling her this. "And me," she whispered. "Why me?" Richard studied her with an intensity that made her want to shrink back, yet unable to look away. "Because you were invisible to them, and yet not to me. You were real in a room full of masks. That is why I pointed to you." He leaned forward slightly, lowering his tone as though sharing a secret. "I want you to play a part, Hannah." For a moment her mind refused to process his words. Then suspicion flared. "A part," she echoed, her throat dry. He nodded. "I need someone to stand beside me. Not as a wife, not yet, but as a companion. The world will accept someone who will silence the whispers long enough for me to breathe. It will not be forever, just until the pressure eases." Hannah recoiled inwardly. "You want me to pretend to be your partner?" Richard's expression did not waver. "I want you to appear with me at events, to sit beside me when the vultures circle, to remind them that my life is my own. For this you will be compensated generously." Her fingers tightened around the glass. Compensated. The word stung, dragging her back to her threadbare apartment and the stack of hospital bills for her mother's care. She thought of the landlord's text, the eviction looming. Still pride warred with desperation. "I am a cleaner," she said bitterly. "They will laugh. They already laughed." He shook his head. "Let them. I do not choose to live by their approval. Besides, the right narrative can shift opinion. I have resources to manage that." Hannah wanted to protest further, but the images came unbidden. Her mother in bed, her breathing shallow, the doctor's warnings about treatment being cut off without payment. She bit her lip until it almost bled. "Why me?" she whispered again, this time more fragile. Richard's eyes softened just slightly. "Because you have nothing to gain but survival, and that makes you more honest than any of them." His words struck deeper than she expected. She dropped her gaze, shame and longing colliding. "What are you offering?" His reply was quiet but firm. "A monthly stipend large enough to cover your expenses. Full health insurance for your mother at the best facility in the state. Housing if you need it. In exchange, your presence when I require it. Appearances. A role." The room seemed to sway as Hannah absorbed the enormity. The promise of security dangled before her like forbidden fruit. She shook her head, overwhelmed. I can't, I shouldn't. Richard reached for the water glass she still gripped, steadying her hand so the liquid did not spill. You do not have to smile for them, he said gently. Just breathe. The kindness in his tone, so unexpected, unraveled her defenses. He was supposed to be cold, untouchable, yet here he was grounding her with the simplest of comforts. Her breath shuddered. Outside the city, lights blurred, mirroring the tears she refused to shed. The humiliation of being summoned, the temptation of his offer, the glimpse of gentleness beneath his armor, all collided in a storm of emotions that left her trembling. I need to think she managed. Of course, he said, leaning back, with controlled composure, though his eyes did not leave hers. Take tonight, but understand, Hannah, time is not a luxury in your situation. His words struck a nerve, confirming what he somehow knew about her struggles. She rose abruptly, needing to escape, but paused at the door. Why me? She asked one last time, her voice almost breaking. Richard's reply was simple, but it echoed with gravity. Because I am rarely wrong about people. The sweet door closed behind her with a quiet click, leaving her heart pounding and her mind consumed by an impossible choice: pride or survival freedom or security fear, or the possibility of something she could not yet name. Morning light spilled into Hannah's tiny apartment, through thin curtains painting the cracked walls, with a gray hue that felt more like resignation than hope. She had not slept. The weight of Richard Blackwell's proposition pressed on her chest, all night shifting between temptation and terror. She had replayed his voice, telling her you do not have to smile for them, just breathe, until the words blurred into her dreams. At dawn, she rose, made weak coffee, and sat at the small table where unopened bills and medical notices were stacked like tombstones. Her mother's cough echoed faintly from the bedroom, each rasp a reminder of time slipping through their fingers. By the time Hannah left for her next shift, her decision had hardened in the silent language of survival. She would accept. When she arrived at the Westridge Grand, the manager intercepted her before she could don her uniform. Mr. Blackwell has arranged a car, he said, his eyes a mixture of envy and suspicion. You're excused from regular duties today. Hannah blinked, uncertain whether to feel relieved or alarmed, but the sleek black sedan waiting outside left no room for denial. Inside the car, a woman introduced herself crisply as Elena, a personal stylist retained by Mr. Blackwell. Without preamble, she began explaining the day's itinerary: fittings, tailoring, makeup, etiquette, coaching. Hannah sat stunned, clutching her worn purse, like a lifeline, her mind reeling. At a luxury boutique downtown, mirrors surrounded her from every angle, as fabrics she had never touched were draped against her skin. Silk that shimmered like liquid moonlight, velvet that whispered against her fingertips, gowns that transformed her reflection into someone she barely recognized. Seamstresses moved quickly, pinning hems and adjusting waistlines with murmured precision. Elna appraised her with sharp eyes, instructing the team as if Hannah were clay being molded into a new form. Hours passed in a blur of zippers and pins, until finally Hannah stood before a full-length mirror in an emerald gown that hugged her frame elegantly, the deep green setting off the warmth of her eyes, and the soft brown of her hair now styled in waves rather than bound in a net. For the first time she could remember, Hannah did not see the weary cleaner staring back. She saw a woman who might belong in a ballroom. Her breath caught. Perfect, came a voice from behind her. Richard had arrived silently, his reflection now beside hers in the mirror. He wore a tailored suit of midnight black that sharpened the lines of his already commanding frame. His gaze lingered not with possession, but with something like awe that unsettled her more than disdain ever could. She turned quickly, her cheeks heating, unsure how to respond. He offered only a faint smile and said we should go. The gala was already underway when their car rolled up to the Belmont Hall. Flashbulbs burst like fireworks as cameras caught Richard Blackwell's stepping onto the carpet, and then gasps rippled as Hannah emerged on his arm. The crowd murmured, whispers flared. Who is she? Isn't she staff from the cleaning crew? Hannah's stomach tightened, but Richard's hands steadied at her waist, his presence shielding her like armor. Inside the hall, chandeliers blazed above marble floors, the same world of wealth Hannah had once observed from shadows. Now she entered through the front, every eye following. A socialite named Margaret intercepted them almost immediately, her voice dripping with contempt, masked as civility. From the cleaning staff, really, Richard? Is this some new form of charity? Hannah's face burned, but before she could retreat, Richard's grip firmed. She is with me. He set his voice sharp enough to cut the air. The declaration hung heavy, silencing further taunts. Margaret's smile faltered before she retreated her whispers, leaving trails of venom in her wake. Hannah exhaled shakily, gratitude and confusion colliding inside her. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Richard's reply was low, meant only for her. Because it is the only way they learn. Hours of introductions blurred into a haze. Hannah forced herself to smile, to offer polite nods as strangers assessed her like an artifact. She caught fragments of their murmurs, gold digger experiment scandal. But Richard's unwavering presence beside her dulled the sting. He guided conversations effortlessly, deflecting probing questions, with charm always keeping Hannah included. Each time she faltered, he gave a reassuring glance, a subtle squeeze of her hand. Slowly, almost against her will, she began to breathe easier. Then came the moment that would ignite everything. Unseen by them, the freelance journalist from the previous night had returned, this time streaming live. His lens caught Hannah in emerald silk, Richard's hand at her back, their silhouettes striking beneath chandeliers. The caption he typed was simple but explosive: Billionaire Blackwell and the Cleaner Girl. Within minutes, the feed spread across social media, comments pouring in. Some mocked, some speculated, others romanticized. The story had already escaped the walls of the ballroom. Hannah sensed none of this yet. She only felt the warmth of Richard's hand as he leaned close to whisper, "You are doing better than they deserve." A part of her wanted to protest, to insist she was drowning beneath the weight of scrutiny. But another part of her, fragile and long-buried, felt seen. She lifted her chin, met the stares with quiet strength, and for the first time in months did not feel entirely broken. As the orchestra swelled and the gala spun around them, Hannah realized her life had crossed a threshold. The girl who had entered this world with bleach on her hands was gone. In her place stood a woman in emerald silk, held in the gaze of a billionaire who had pointed once and altered everything. What it meant and what it would cost remained terrifyingly unclear, but the story had begun, and she was no longer invisible. The limousine doors shut behind them with a muted thud, sealing Hannah into a cocoon of leather seats and hushed space where the echoes of the gala's chatter still lingered in her ears. Her hands rested stiffly in her lap, the emerald gown pooling around her like borrowed skin, while Richard sat opposite her silent, his gaze fixed on the darkened city, sliding past the tinted windows. The tension was unbearable, not hostile but charged, as though both were acutely aware of the line they had crossed by appearing together. Hannah wanted to ask why to demand what his plan truly was, yet her voice refused to surface. When the car finally slowed before the wrought iron gates of his estate, she felt her chest constrict. The mansion rose before them like a fortress, stone walls and sweeping windows glowing faintly in the night, surrounded by manicured gardens that whispered of wealth she could never have imagined. Guards opened the doors with precise deference, and Hannah followed Richard through the vast foyer where marble floors gleamed beneath chandeliers, and oil paintings loomed like silent judges. She felt painfully out of place, her thrift store coat still clutched awkwardly in her arms. But Richard's stride was steady as he led her toward a quiet sitting room off the main hall. Here the opulence softened shelves of books, a fire crackling low, and a table set with tea. "Sit," he said gently. And though the command made her bristle, exhaustion pulled her into the chair. Richard removed his jacket, loosened his tie, and with surprising ease began to brew chamomile tea, moving with the competence of someone who had done this many times alone. Hannah blinked, startled. "You make tea?" she murmured before she could stop herself. He glanced at her with a ghost of a smile. "I live here, but that does not mean I am incapable of boiling water." He poured the steaming liquid into a porcelain cup and slid it across the table to her. "You look exhausted. Rest first, we will talk tomorrow." The simple act of kindness unsettled her more than his public claim earlier. She lifted the cup, hands trembling, and inhaled the calming scent. It was the first time in weeks anyone had offered her comfort without asking for something in return. Yet she knew comfort was not free, not in his world. The silence stretched until she forced herself to speak. "What exactly do you expect of me?" His eyes held hers, dark and steady. "I need you to remain by my side for the foreseeable future, to appear with me at functions to silence the vultures who circle whenever they smell vulnerability. In exchange, you will be compensated fairly." Her stomach twisted. "You mean bought?" "No," he said firmly, his tone carrying steel, protected. The distinction mattered to him, though Hannah was not sure it did to her. She set down the cup, her pulse racing. "I should say no. You should," he agreed, calmly leaning back in his chair, "but you will not." She bristled, anger flaring. "You think I am that desperate?" His gaze softened, almost regretful. "I think you are carrying burdens alone that would break most people. You do not have the luxury of pride when survival demands sacrifice." The truth of his words struck like a blow. Hannah's throat tightened as she remembered the email she had checked in the car earlier, the hospital warning that treatment for her mother would cease if payments were not received by the end of the week. The number glared at her mind like fire. $15,000. It might as well have been 15 million. She swallowed hard. "And if I refuse?" "Then you return to your life," he said evenly, "but the bills remain, and the vultures will still circle me. Nothing changes except you lose a chance to change your fate." His calmness infuriated her, yet beneath the fury was despair. She rose abruptly, pacing the room, the emerald gown whispering against the carpet. Her reflection in the window startled her elegant, poised a stranger. She pressed her palms against the glass, as if she could crawl back into the shadows she once inhabited. "I am not like them," she whispered, voice cracking. "I cannot play their games." Richard rose too, closing the distance between them with measured steps. "Then do not play. Simply stand beside me. Let them choke on their assumptions." His voice was low, magnetic, a promise wrapped in defiance. Hannah turned sharply, tears stinging her eyes. Why me? Why drag me into this spectacle? His expression flickered with something vulnerable before it hardened again. "Because when I looked across that room, I saw someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, someone who could remind me I am still human." The confession disarmed her. She sank back into the chair, covering her face with her hands. "This is madness," she whispered. Perhaps he admitted, but madness can be a refuge when the alternative is suffocation. He returned to his chair, steepling his fingers as the firelight played across his features. "Take tonight to consider. The guest room is prepared." Hannah blinked, startled again. "You expect me to stay here?" "It is late," he said simply. "Safer here than out there with the paparazzi already circling." She hesitated, suspicion prickling, but exhaustion pulled heavier. At last she nodded reluctantly. "Fine, just for tonight." Richard inclined his head as if sealing a contract, then summoned a staff member who led Hannah through corridors so vast she lost count of turns. The guest room was larger than her entire apartment, furnished with soft linens and a window overlooking gardens that shimmered with moonlight. She stood alone in the quiet, staring at the bed, at the life that seemed to have swallowed hers whole in a single day. She should run, she thought. Pack her things, vanish before dawn. Yet when she touched her phone, the screen lit up with another hospital notice. The deadline closer now than ever. Tears blurred her vision. Survival left little room for pride. Lying back on the bed, she inhaled the faint scent of lavender on the sheets and closed her eyes. Somewhere in the mansion, Richard Blackwell moved through his own sleepless night, each of them caught in the trap of necessity. One by desperation, the other by expectation. Behind closed doors, their worlds had collided, and neither could walk away unscathed. The first mornings in Richard Blackwell's mansion felt unreal to Hannah, as though she had wandered into a dream stitched together by silk sheets and silence too heavy to be comfortable. She awoke in the vast guest room, the sun slanting across the high ceiling, and for a moment she forgot where she was until the memory of the gala crashed back and made her stomach twist. She dressed quickly in the simple clothes provided for her, still clinging to the modesty of her old life, and wandered down corridors lined with art she could not name. Staff nodded politely, but kept their distance, and Hannah felt like both a guest and a prisoner. Richard, meanwhile, kept his distance in another way. He was courteous but formal, treating her with the careful respect one might grant a colleague rather than a stranger sharing his home. Yet Hannah began to notice patterns in his behavior. Every morning he ate breakfast alone in the solarium with a single black coffee and toast, his phone buzzing with calls he never seemed eager to take. Every night he read late into the evening, thick volumes of philosophy and history that surprised her. Loneliness clung to him like a second skin. One evening, after days of silence, punctuated only by instructions from his staff, Richard surprised her by inviting her to dinner at the long oak table in the dining hall. The room was intimidating with its vaulted ceiling and flickering candles, but he motioned for her to sit not far from him, narrowing the intimidating distance of the massive table. They ate quietly at first, the clink of silverware the only sound, until Richard broke the silence. "You taught once, didn't you?" Hannah froze, startled. "How did you know?" He shrugged lightly. "I make it my business to know the people around me." She lowered her gaze, shame tightening her throat. "I was a teacher until my father ruined everything." Richard's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Children?" he asked. "Third grade," she whispered, her lips curving with bittersweet memory. "They were curious about everything. They made me feel like what I did mattered. And then it ended overnight." Her voice trembled, but she steadied it. He studied her quietly, as though weighing the layers of her pain. "I lost my wife 3 years ago," he said abruptly, his tone stripped of the polished armor he usually wore. Hannah looked up sharply, taken aback by the rawness in his words. "A car accident. One moment she was there, the next she was not. I buried myself in work because it was easier than remembering." Hannah's chest ached with a sudden empathy she had not expected. "I am sorry," she said softly. He nodded once, not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement, and returned to his meal. But something had shifted between them, an unspoken recognition of wounds carried silently. In the days that followed, their connection grew in subtle ways. Hannah began to manage small details of his schedule at his request, organizing invitations, filtering calls, preparing notes. She discovered his dislike for the pompous theatrics of social events, his preference for quiet dinners over glittering galas. He in turn began to notice her habits, how she hummed softly when nervous, how she rubbed her fingers over the strap of her bag when lost in thought, how she paused to read the spines of books in the library as if starved for stories. There were moments that startled her with their intimacy. One afternoon in the kitchen, she reached for the salt at the same moment he did, their hands brushing. She withdrew quickly, cheeks burning, but he held her gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary, something unspoken passing between them. Another evening she found him in the library, a heavy book open in his lap. He looked up hesitant. "Do you read philosophy?" "A little," she admitted, stepping closer. He handed her the book. "It is about solitude. I thought I understood it, but now I wonder if I only ran from it." She sat opposite him, and for the first time they spoke not as employer and employee, but as two people confessing the weight of their loneliness. The walls between them bent, though neither dared push them down. Yet just as easily as closeness emerged, distance returned. Richard often retreated into silence, his grief still raw, and Hannah reminded herself that her role was temporary, contractual, not personal. Emotional undulation defined their days, a moment of warmth, followed by a cold retreat, a smile undone by guarded silence. Still, the fragile thread of connection grew stronger. One night, as rain lashed against the windows, Hannah lingered in the dining hall after dinner, staring out at the storm. Richard approached quietly, a glass of wine in his hand. "Do you miss teaching?" he asked. Every day, she confessed without hesitation. He studied her profile in the dim light. "Then perhaps this is not the end of your story, only the middle." The words struck her deeply, like a promise she had forgotten how to make to herself. She turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. For a moment, the storm outside mirrored the turmoil within her. The longing to believe she was more than a contract, more than a pawn in his defiance. But she bit back the words, retreating into silence. He did not press, simply nodded and walked away, leaving her to the rain and her restless thoughts. Alone in her room later, Hannah lay awake replaying the night. Each subtle kindness, each fragment of vulnerability, pulled her closer to something dangerous hope. She feared it resisted it, but could not deny the flicker of life it brought back into her. Meanwhile, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at a photograph of his late wife, torn between loyalty to the past and the quiet possibility of healing that Hannah represented. Neither spoke their truths, but both felt the tide shifting beneath their feet. In the quiet of the mansion, two wounded souls circled each other, sometimes colliding in sparks of honesty, sometimes retreating into shadows. Yet with each passing day, the distance between them lessened, and the fragile beginnings of something real began to take root, no longer masked by contracts or expectations. The morning it happened, Hannah woke to the trill of her phone, vibrating against the nightstand, its screen flooded with notifications that made her blood run cold before she even unlocked it. Headlines screamed across social media: Billionaire, Blackwell, and the cleaner girl. Dozens of images captured from the gala showed her in the emerald gown, Richard's hand resting at her back, her face illuminated by chandeliers and camera flashes. Some captions were mocking, others curious, and some outright cruel. Hannah's chest tightened as she scrolled through comments, her fingers trembling. Gold digger, social experiment, another Cinderella fantasy. Beneath them were even harsher words, strangers dissecting her appearance, her background, her worth. She dropped the phone onto the bed bile, rising in her throat. A knock came at the door. "Hannah, it's Richard." His voice was steady, but she heard the strain beneath. She opened the door reluctantly, her hair tousled, her face pale. He stood immaculate as always, phone in hand. "It's out," he said simply. She nodded, unable to speak. "I expected this," he continued, "but I didn't expect it to spread this quickly." Hannah wrapped her arms around herself, whispering, "They know I'm just a cleaner." Richard's jaw tightened. "Let them know. You're with me." His certainty unsettled her, but it did not soothe the dread curling in her stomach. Hours later, the storm grew fiercer. News outlets ran with the story, each headline more sensational than the last. Talk shows debated her motives, pundits speculated whether Richard had lost his mind, and glossy magazines mocked the idea of a billionaire choosing someone so ordinary. Paparazzi swarmed the gates of his estate, shouting questions whenever a car passed. Hannah remained inside, trapped between fear and humiliation. By afternoon, the scandal took a darker turn. Margaret, the socialite, humiliated at the gala, had whispered to a journalist, planting seeds of poison. Soon, an investigative piece surfaced: Hannah Miller, daughter of convicted fraudster Daniel Miller, who had served time for financial crimes that shook their community years ago. The headline paired her father's mugshot beside her image from the gala, the juxtaposition cruel and damning. Hannah's knees buckled as she read, tears blurring her vision. The sins of her father had returned to crush her again, this time on a national stage. She stumbled into the study, where Richard was on a call, his voice sharp with irritation. He ended it abruptly when he saw her pale face. "They know about my father," she choked. "They've published it everywhere." Richard's eyes darkened as he took the tablet from her trembling hands, scanning the article. "This changes nothing," he said firmly. but it changes everything, she cried. Your reputation, your company, the board, they'll say, I'm a stain on your name. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her breath hitching. I can't drag you down with me. His voice rose uncharacteristically raw. You think I care what they say? You think their approval matters more than what I decide? But Hannah's shame was deeper than his assurance could reach. She remembered the whispers when her father was arrested, the children pulled from her classroom by parents who no longer trusted her. She could not let history repeat itself on a grander stage. That evening she packed her modest belongings, tears blurring every movement. When Richard found her by the door, she lifted her chin with fragile resolve. I can't stay, not when the whole world thinks I'm using you. He stepped forward, blocking her path, fury and desperation flashing in his eyes. This is not your choice alone, Hannah. You're not a problem to be solved, He stopped the words, choking him. She shook her head, swallowing back sobs. You don't understand. My whole life people have looked at me and seen only his daughter, his crime. I can't let them say the same about you. Richard's hands curled into fists at his sides. So you'll run? That's your answer? She bit her lip until it bled, whispering, Maybe it's the only answer. For a long moment, they stared at each other, silence heavy with things unsaid. Then she slipped past him, her heart breaking with every step. Richard stood frozen, his chest heaving, anger and helplessness colliding. Alone again, just as the world expected him to be. Outside the gates, paparazzi lights exploded as Hannah exited in a plain coat. Her head bowed, her departure captured as proof of the scandal. Richard watched from an upstairs window, his reflection fractured in the glass. For the first time in years, the empire he commanded felt powerless against the weight of perception. The scandal had broken not only across the headlines, but within them both, driving a wedge that no contract could mend. Hannah returned to her apartment that night, the silence oppressive, her mother coughing softly in the next room. She curled against the wall, clutching her knees, telling herself she had done the right thing, even as her heart whispered otherwise. Richard remained in his study, the fire burned low, and for hours he stared at the glowing embers, as if searching for a way to hold together what had already begun to slip through his fingers. Richard did not sleep the night Hannah left, pacing the length of his study until dawn bled gray light across the tall windows. Every instinct told him to let her go, to retreat into the cold armor he had worn since his wife's death. But the image of her walking past the flashing cameras with her head bowed haunted him. He could not stand by while the world crucified her for sins that were not hers. By mid-morning, he had dispatched his legal team to trace the source of the leaks, but even as he signed papers and barked orders, his mind replayed her voice whispering, I can't drag you down with me. He understood then that she had not left for herself, but for him. That realization pierced deeper than any headline. By evening, he made a decision. He told his driver to take him not to the office, not to a board meeting, but to the small public hospital where he knew Hannah's mother received treatment. When he arrived, the air was heavy with disinfectant and the hum of machines. He walked past nurses who whispered at the sight of him, ignoring their surprise, until he found Hannah sitting by her mother's bedside. She was reading softly from a battered paperback, her hair loose around her face, exhaustion etched into every line of her posture. For a long moment, Richard simply stood in the doorway, watching the quiet devotion that no one else in the world seemed to see. Hannah looked up at last, her eyes widening with shock before narrowing with guarded defiance. "What are you doing here?" He stepped into the room, his voice low but firm. "Making sure you're not alone." She bristled, standing quickly. "You shouldn't be here, not after everything." "If anyone sees you," he cut her off. "Let them see." Hannah's mother stirred her weak voice, breaking the tension. "Who is this, Hannah?" Hannah swallowed hard, torn between shame and truth. "This is a friend," she managed. Richard moved closer to the bedside, his expression softening as he looked at the frail woman. "I'm Richard," he said gently. "I owe your daughter more than you know." Her mother smiled faintly, her eyes cloudy but warm. She always was stronger than she realized. Hannah's throat tightened as she fought back tears. Richard pulled a chair closer and sat his presence steady, as if he intended to stay for as long as it took. Over the next hours he listened as Hannah read aloud, offering her water when her voice cracked, adjusting the blanket when her mother shivered. He did not speak much, but his silence was no longer distant. It was supportive grounding. At one point he leaned over and whispered, "You don't have to carry this alone." Hannah shook her head fiercely, whispering back, "You don't understand. My father's crimes follow me everywhere. People will never see past them." Richard's eyes darkened with conviction. "Then let them choke on their prejudice. You are not your father's sins." She stared at him, her defenses wavering. "You really believe that?" "I know that," he said simply. Later, when her mother drifted into sleep, Richard stepped into the hallway with Hannah. There, under the harsh fluorescent lights, her composure finally cracked. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, tears spilling. "I told you I don't want to be your contract. I don't want to be a shield you use." Richard's gaze softened with something she had not seen before, something unguarded. "You're not Hannah. Don't you see? When you walked away, I realized what I stood to lose. This isn't about the board or the press. It's about you." Her breath caught disbelief and longing colliding. He reached into his pocket, pulling out an envelope. "I had my team review your mother's case. She can receive specialized treatment at a better facility. It's already arranged." Hannah's eyes widened, shock mingling with anger. "You had no right." Richard's voice was calm but resolute. "I had every right because I care. Because watching you break yourself against this world when you deserve more is unbearable to me." She shook her head, overwhelmed. "You don't understand. Care is dangerous. Every time someone cares, it ends in betrayal. First my father, then the school when they turned their backs, and now this." Richard stepped closer, his voice steady. "Then let me be the exception." She looked at him, trembling, every instinct screaming to retreat. Yet the sincerity in his eyes disarmed her. In that moment she saw not the billionaire, not the empire, but a man stripped bare by loneliness, reaching for her. A nurse passed, giving them a curious glance, but the world outside seemed to recede. Hannah whispered, "I don't want to lose myself in your story." Richard answered softly, "You won't. You'll rewrite it with me." Silence stretched heavy with possibility, until Hannah exhaled shakily, her shoulders sagging under the weight she had carried alone for too long. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean just slightly into the comfort he offered. That night, Richard remained at the hospital, refusing to leave until Hannah and her mother were settled. He brought food she had not tasted in months, sat beside her as she ate reluctantly, and when exhaustion overtook her, he covered her with his own coat. As he watched her sleep in the hard hospital chair, he realized the truth that had been building within him. She was not a placeholder or a shield, not a contract or a facade. She was the one who had slipped past his defenses, who had reminded him of humanity in a world of masks. He had thought choosing her at the gala was defiance. Now he understood it was destiny. The night after the hospital visit, Hannah returned to her apartment for the first time in days, carrying with her the weight of Richard's presence and the echo of his words that she was not her father's sins. The apartment felt smaller than ever, its peeling wallpaper and creaking floorboards suffocating, compared to the quiet expanse of his mansion. Yet it was hers, the last remnant of a life she understood. She sat by the window, staring out at the city lights, her thoughts tangled between fear and fragile hope. Richard had not pressed her for answers when she leaned into him at the hospital, but the memory of his steady warmth lingered like a question she could not escape. The next evening he appeared at her door without ceremony, dressed simply in a dark sweater and jeans, instead of his usual armor of tailored suits. Hannah blinked at the sight, startled, and he offered a small smile that was almost shy. "May I come in?" She hesitated before stepping aside, letting him enter the cramped space that suddenly felt exposed. He surveyed the room quietly, taking in the stack of bills on the table, the books piled by her bed, the fading photos on the wall. His gaze softened, but he said nothing until she sat, her hands clenched in her lap. "Why are you really here?" she asked at last, her voice unsteady. Richard lowered himself into the chair opposite, leaning forward. "Because I need you to understand something. You don't belong in the shadows, Hannah. Not to me." Her throat tightened, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "You don't know what you're saying. You don't know what it costs to be near me." He shook his head. "I know exactly what it costs. I've lived every day under scrutiny, every choice questioned, every loss magnified. And yet, the moment you walked into my life, everything shifted. I stopped caring what the world demanded because I found something worth defying it for." Hannah's tears spilled, her voice breaking. "I don't want to be your contract, Richard. I don't want to be some bargain you struck with fate. I want to be myself, even if that means losing you." Richard rose, crossing the small space until he stood before her. "Then be yourself," he said gently, his hand brushing the edge of the cluttered table. "That's all I want." He noticed the wilted flowers in a glass jar nearby their stems, bent petals scattered. Without hesitation, he picked up the jar, emptied the water, and carefully rearranged the broken stalks. When he set them back down, he whispered, "Broken things can be beautiful too." The words pierced through her defenses, tender and raw. She looked up at him, her vision blurred, and saw not the billionaire who had pointed to her at a gala, but a man standing in her tiny apartment, choosing to care when he had every reason not to. The dam inside her broke. "I'm so tired," she confessed, her voice trembling. "Tired of being ashamed, tired of running, tired of fighting alone." He crouched before her, his hands gently covering hers. "Then don't fight alone anymore. Let me fight with you." Her breath hitched the simplicity of his offer, undoing her completely. She leaned forward, her forehead against his, the closeness electric yet soothing. For a long moment they stayed that way, the city's noise fading beyond the thin walls. And then, almost without realizing, her lips found his. It was not the desperate kiss of fairy tales, but something deeper, a merging of broken pieces seeking solace. His hands cradled her face with reverence, as though she were something fragile yet precious, and she melted into the truth of it. When they parted breathless, she whispered, "I'm scared." He answered softly, "So am I." But sometimes fear is the clearest sign we are standing at the edge of something real. They sat together late into the night, sharing pieces of their stories they had never dared speak aloud. She told him about her dreams of studying medicine, before her father's scandal stole everything. He told her about the guilt he carried from his wife's death, the nights he replayed the accident as though changing a detail could rewrite the ending. They listened not to respond, but to understand, and with each word the weight of solitude lifted. For the first time in years, Hannah felt seen, not as a burden or a scandal, but as herself flawed and resilient. For the first time since his wife's death, Richard felt the stirring of hope, not anchored in duty, but in love. When dawn crept through the window, they remained side by side, weary but unafraid. Hannah reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his, and whispered, "If we do this, we do it honestly. No contracts, no masks." His grip tightened gently. No contracts, he promised, only us. The scandal did not vanish overnight, but Richard Blackwell was a man who had never allowed the world to dictate his choices. And when he decided to claim Hannah openly, the tide began to shift. Days after their confession in her small apartment, he called for a press conference at his corporate headquarters, inviting not only business reporters, but also mainstream media, ensuring that every word would echo across the country. Hannah sat in the wings of the atrium, her heart hammering so loudly, she feared it might drown out the murmurs of the gathered crowd. She wanted to run, but Richard's steady presence at the podium anchored her. Cameras flashed as he adjusted the microphone, his voice clear and commanding as it filled the space. For weeks there has been speculation, he began measured but resolute. You have seen photos, you have read headlines, you have been told stories crafted to mock and divide. Today I will tell you the truth. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room, daring anyone to look away. The woman you have seen by my side is not a scandal, not a symbol, not a contract. She is the woman I love. A collective gasp rippled through the audience, followed by the frenzied clicking of cameras. Richard did not flinch. Her name is Hannah Miller. Some of you know her past, and some of you believe that past defines her. You are wrong. What defines her is courage. What defines her is resilience. What defines her is the compassion that this world too often overlooks. His voice hardened. I will not allow her to be vilified for circumstances she did not choose. If you wish to attack someone, attack me. I am not ashamed to love her. Hannah felt tears spill down her cheeks, her hands trembling as she pressed them together. For the first time in her life, someone powerful had not turned away from her shame, but had chosen to stand inside it, with her transforming it into strength. Questions erupted from reporters, but Richard silenced them with a raised hand. That is all, he said firmly, and stepped down from the podium. In the chaos that followed, he walked straight to Hannah, ignoring the flashing lights, and took her hand before the world. Together they exited their fingers, intertwined the whispers, chasing them, but unable to break the bond forged in fire. In the weeks that followed, the narrative began to shift. Some continued to mock, but others were moved by the sight of a billionaire defying expectation for love. Articles appeared highlighting Hannah's dedication, To her mother, the years she had taught children with patience and care, the quiet dignity she carried despite relentless scrutiny, the image of Richard standing beside her unshaken, became a symbol not of scandal, but of defiance against superficiality. Their relationship did not magically erase obstacles. Hannah struggled with the attention, the invasive photographers, the cruel words that still found her online. Yet each time she faltered, Richard reminded her of his promise: no masks, no contracts, only us. He accompanied her to the hospital, regularly sitting with her mother for hours, reading aloud when Hannah's voice grew hoarse. He insisted on paying for the specialized treatment, but he did so quietly, never making her feel like a charity case. He listened when she confessed her dreams of medicine and told her she still had time, that 30 was not the end but the beginning. Slowly, Hannah began to believe him. Months later, her mother improved her color, returning her laughter soft but real. Hannah cried the first time she heard her mother humming again, and Richard held her as though her joy were his own. With her mother's health stabilizing, Hannah enrolled in a program to become a nurse, a compromise between her childhood dream and the reality she now embraced. The day she received her acceptance letter, she ran to Richard breathless, waving the envelope like a child, and he lifted her into his arms, laughing for the first time in years. Their love grew not in the glare of ballrooms, but in the quiet moments that truly mattered. Dinners cooked together, in the kitchen books read aloud, by the fireplace walks in the garden at dusk where the world felt far away. Richard learned to laugh again. Hannah learned to trust again, and together they began to heal the fractures life had carved into them. One evening, months after the press conference, Richard surprised her with a small gathering at the mansion. Not a gala, not a spectacle, but a dinner with close friends, colleagues, and even a few of Hannah's former students now grown. As the evening wound down, he stood and raised a glass, his eyes fixed on her. To the woman who reminded me that love is not weakness, but strength, who taught me that broken things can indeed be beautiful, he said. Hannah's eyes filled with tears as the guests applauded. Later that night, in the quiet of the garden under the stars, Richard knelt on one knee, not with the fanfare of photographers, but with the humility of a man offering his heart. Hannah, will you marry me? Not as a contract, not as a shield, but as my partner, my equal, my love. Her breath caught, and with tears streaming down her face, she whispered yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, simple but radiant, and kissed her as the night embraced them. Epilogue. The wedding was not a grand affair, but an intimate ceremony in the gardens of his estate, attended by those who truly mattered. Hannah walked down the aisle in a gown of soft ivory, her mother watching proudly from the front row. Richard, waiting with eyes that held no doubt. When they spoke their vows, it was not the world they promised to impress, but each other. Richard vowed to protect not her image, but her spirit. Hannah vowed to walk beside him, not in fear, but in trust. They sealed their vows with a kiss, as sunlight broke through the clouds, the beginning of a life built not on contracts or appearances, but on love forged through trial and redemption. In the years that followed, Hannah became a nurse, tending to lives with the same compassion she had once given to her students, while Richard continued to lead his empire with a steadiness softened by her influence. At night, they returned not to ballrooms, but to shared meals, laughter, and the quiet joy of companionship. She had entered his life as a cleaner, unseen and overlooked, but she stayed as his equal, his partner, his love. And in the end, that was the story the world remembered.